Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going through all of the F-16s currently in War Thunder and rating them from the worst to the best. So which one do you think underperforms and which one do you think overperforms? Stay tuned to see. Now to start off, we're actually going to go over some basic characteristics of the F-16 to at least give you some idea of where you're starting at and where this family generally has strengths and weaknesses. And the first thing we're going to look at is the acceleration. The F-16s can accelerate quite fast. In fact, they're one of the faster aircraft in the game in terms of acceleration, only really being beaten out by a noticeable margin by things like the Yak-141. However, despite their high acceleration, their top speed isn't that great. Most planes in a straight line could eventually outrun them, but over any short distance, the acceleration of the F-16 does give it a pretty solid advantage. Additionally, if you just leave the throttle at around 100%, the F-16 will stay at about Mach 0.95 pretty easily, so the aircraft does generally get up to speed quickly and maintains its speed quickly. And that of course brings us into the turning characteristics. The energy retention, or the ability of the F-16 to keep its speed in a turn, is incredibly good. It's not the best in the game, but it is pretty far up there. So you can generally stay at about Mach 0.8 to Mach 0.9 in a turn, as long as you're not just slamming on the elevator. Additionally, its overall turning characteristics, at very high speeds it can lock up. The fly-by-wire system will put some artificial limitations on it, and at very low speeds its stall performance is not great and it can be beaten, but at around 600 to 800 kilometers an hour, the F-16 is almost completely unmatched. There are very few planes in the game that will outperform it at this speed. So overall, the F-16 is one of those aircraft that I would call very intuitive to fly. It does all of the things you expect a fast fighter plane to do, and you're never really going to find yourself fighting the airframe. There aren't any weird wing rip issues if you pull G's at just the wrong angle. There aren't any eccentric flight performance characteristics that really hold it back. It's just kind of a very easy airframe to use. And as far as the various equipment the F-16 has on it, every F-16 has a radar warning receiver, specifically the fairly good type that will tell you not just that there is a radar in a general area, but also what type of radar it is, so you can tell if that's a plane or an anti-air or even what type of plane. On top of the fact, you also get chaffs and flares, optional if you want to equip them. Then you also have a radar that's a pulse Doppler, so it's pretty good at locking things that are moving directly towards you. In fact, if enemies are moving directly towards you, it maintains the lock very well, even through things like chaff. Additionally, you have the 20mm Vulcan. This is probably the best gun for air-to-air combat in the game. High muzzle velocity, high rate of fire. You can just laser somebody out of the air pretty easily, so overall a very good weapon. However, it does have kind of an odd feature in that if you have somebody locked, it will use the lead computing ability of the plane to place your crosshair where your bullets should theoretically hit, and if you put that on the target, it should hit them. But the problem with this sight is you don't get the normal gun like crosshair while you're using it, and it only really works if the person is moving basically in a straight line. So I personally try to avoid locking people at all if I want to use the gun, because I just find it very awkward to use, but your mileage may vary. Additionally, I also use the visual range only radar mode a lot, which you can see it in the video in the background. It will be scanning in a very small box in front of you. This allows it to pick up targets incredibly fast, much faster than trying to manually cycle through them. So that is one thing you could do. I also turn the radar off a lot when I'm not actively using it, so I don't give away my position, but that's just personal preference. And as a little aside, I will be putting the loadouts I have for each of these F-16s on screen, bottom middle, so that if you want to, you can use them. If you don't, you can ignore them, that's fine. I just want you to know what I'm using in this gameplay footage, just for reference. And as of the Sons of Attila patch, all F-16s have this fun little helper to let you know everything you're doing wrong. You can disable this in the option menu if you so choose.
Left, roll left, dangerous close, air brake on, dangerous close.
And for our first F-16 and the worst one that we will be looking at in this video, this is the American F-16A. The very first thing you will notice with this F-16 is the flat tail. The flat tail is a worse control surface than on most of the other F-16s. However, the F-16A is the lightest out of the group, so it does cancel out to an extent. And the F-16A can also turn with other F-16s really well. The problem is really when you get to the weapon systems. You only have 6 AIM-9Ls, so in air-to-air combat, your options for taking out enemies are limited to enemies that aren't paying attention or enemies that you have a rear aspect shot on. This does limit your ability to clean up kills quickly, and because you can't really clean up kills quickly, it really limits your damage potential and is going to lead to a lot of enemies just getting away or taking a lot longer to take out. In the air-to-ground role, the F-16A is fairly competent. You do have access to Mavericks, you do have access to the GBU-15s, which are optically guided bombs, and you can take a mix of 6 Mavericks and 2 GBU-15s. This is a reasonably effective loadout, and just the GBU-15s by themselves are also reasonably effective. The problem with this airframe is really that, well, it's just in the American air tree, because it turns out the American air tree has some of the stiffest competition in the entire game for both the air-to-air and air-to-ground role, and the F-16 doesn't really stand out. There's arguably about 4 or 5 aircraft that can generally do as good, if not better than it, in the air-to-air role, and in the air-to-ground role, it's kind of the same story. It just manages to be unremarkable enough in every area, and that it doesn't really have a lot of applications, and ultimately just serves as a stepping stone to other generally more useful F-16s. However, it is reasonably versatile, so it does at least have that going for it, and at the end of the day, it is still an F-16, so you can still clean up in air and ground battles. Now for the second worst slot for the F-16s, we have the Nets. Now the Nets has 2 notable differences between it and the F-16A, but is otherwise the same, including having the flat tail and also being relatively light. The 2 major differences, and the one that really puts it above the F-16A, is the fact that the Nets has access to Python 3s. The Python 3 missile is similar to the AIM-9L in that it doesn't have any profound flare resistance. It is still pretty flareable, but unlike the AIM-9Ls, it has an engine that stops emitting smoke after a relatively short distance, and it's also incredibly fast and pulls a lot of Gs. So the Pythons are very good at surprising people or catching them off guard, and it will definitely take them out before they notice if they aren't just constantly paying attention. However, it still doesn't have a missile that can hit an opponent that is aware of you, and that's kind of the problem with the Nets, and it's the same problem you have with the F-16A, is you will just have those kills wandering off that you could have secured with any other F-16. In the air-to-ground role, it does have one drawback, and it doesn't have access to the GBU-15 optically guided bombs, so you are limited to unguided bombs or Mavericks, but that's still good enough in most situations. And this is enough for me to put the Nets slightly above the A, but I still view both of these as kind of a suboptimal option for their respective tech trees. For our next aircraft, we have the F-16ADF for both Italy and USA. These 2 aircraft are functionally identical in both nations, and the very first thing you'll notice about them is the tail structure. These have the more complex tail geometry. They are a little heavier, so it does wash out, and these end up being very similar to the F-16As in terms of flight performance. In fact, if you don't play a lot of Air RB battles, you probably won't notice a big difference between the F-16A and ADF in terms of how they fly. And the F-16 ADF does have a big advantage over the other 2 F-16s in that we have access to the AIM-7M Sparrow. The Sparrow is a radar-guided missile. You have to keep them painted with your radar the entire time, but it can hit targets as far away as about 25 kilometers. Sparrows will struggle to hit targets that are really close to the ground, and if the enemy's moving perpendicular to you and notching your radar, they can lose lock. However, they are reasonably maneuverable, they have good range. Overall, it is just a great way to take on enemies that are either in an exposed position or that are trying to head on you and that are too high off the ground to effectively shadow themselves against it. And this does make them really good in the air-to-air role. In fact, they're probably one of the best fighters. Except, and the reason why they're so low, is that they don't have any air-to-ground ordnance at all. So the only thing they can really do in the ground RB role is go around picking off enemy fighters, which is fine, but a lot of other aircraft can do the exact same thing, and the complete lack of versatility, even though they are great in air battles, is really what lands them so low on this list. Next up, we have the F-16 MLU and the F-16 AJ for China and Japan, and I'm broadly going to put these 2 planes together because there's only one difference and it's pretty minor. The AJ has access to Mighty Mouse rockets and the F-16 MLU doesn't. It's not really a big deal. The Mighty Mouse rockets aren't that useful with this battle rating anyway. But if you look at them right away, you're going to notice that they have the same tail structure, they're about the same weight as the F-16 ADFs, and they have the same weapons of the AIM-7L, of the AIM-9Ls, and the AIM-7Ms. So they're pretty good and pretty versatile in the air role. In fact, they're one of the best aircraft in the air-to-air role. And then you get into the fact that they actually have air-to-ground weapons, unlike the F-16 ADF, so they can be very powerful in the air-to-ground role as well. The only thing that really holds them back, and this is what we're going to see separates these from the other 2, the top aircraft for the F-16s, is that they don't have any guided weapons other than the Mavericks. So you're either spending a ton of spawn points on the Mavericks, or you're just getting unguided weapons. doesn't hurt them, it doesn't make them unusable by any means. They're still basically the best option for top tier in their respective tech trees, but it does make them slightly worse than the other two aircraft we're going to see right above them in this ranking list. As the second best aircraft, the silver medal for this competition, we have the Israeli Barak 2, or the F-16D. The game kind of goes back and forth. If you see it in the kill feed, it'll be listed as the F-16D. However, if you see it on the list of different aircraft in the match, it'll show it as the Barak 2, and it shows as the Barak 2 in the tech tree. Now, this is an interesting one because it's actually the heaviest F-16 in the game. It does have a slightly improved engine, but it is still fatter and can still maneuver a little worse than a lot of the contemporary F-16s, and this is notable because you'll fight them fairly often. However, it does have an improved radar that is more resistant to notching. On top of that, you also get access to the brand new AIM-9M missiles. The AIM-9Ms actually have a seeker head that will turn off if it sees flares and then turn back on shortly afterwards, so it has a pretty good degree of flare resistance, especially if you're looking at somebody from the side or top or bottom. If you're looking at somebody from behind, they're also pretty good at hitting too. It's really the front aspect they tend to be kind of inconsistent from. So this actually gives them a pretty good weapon in a lot of scenarios where they can secure kills that simple AIM-9Ls or Pythons wouldn't be able to, and it has a positively ludicrous number of flares, so it can just kind of flare and chaff for days to keep the enemy from maintaining a lock, and it can afford to pre-flare in a lot of situations to keep your opponent from even getting a lock in the first place. And as one last minor note, both the Barak 2 and the next plane we're going to talk about have a helmet-mounted display where you can actually direct the seeker of your infrared missiles at a target without having to physically move the plane. This doesn't work with radar-guided missiles, only the infrared missiles, the AIM-9Ms, but it is still a pretty good feature nonetheless. When you transition to the air-to-ground role, you realize the Barak 2 isn't a slouch in there either. You have access to 1,000, 2,000, or 500-pound laser-guided bombs, and you can deploy these from a fairly good distance and hit targets. Additionally, the 500-pounders come in racks of 2, so you can carry up to 8 of them if you really want to. But perhaps more importantly, you can carry 2 of them on inner pylons and then a Sparrow next to them for a total of 2 Sparrows and 4 500-pound laser-guided bombs, which is a very versatile loadout in the air-to-ground role, and this is what marks the Barak 2 as being one of the stronger options for the F-16 family in general. The only real drawback is that unlike a lot of the other air-to-ground F-16s, it doesn't have access to Mavericks at all, but Mavericks are also kind of expensive and inconsistent, so they're not even a weapon you're always using anyway. Overall, I think this warrants a rating as the second best F-16, but it's definitely not the best. There is one that definitely edges it out. And for the top of the list, the absolute king of the F-16 family, it is the F-16C. The F-16C is very similar to the Barak 2, except it is lighter, and just being lighter allows it to be better in a fight. It doesn't have the absolutely absurd number of flares the Barak 2 does, but it still has way more than any of the other F-16s, so you can flare and chaff pretty considerably and still not really have to worry about running out. In addition to AIM-9Ms, AIM-7Ms, you also have the really good pulse Doppler radar. There really isn't anything you ever have to be afraid of in an F-16C in an air-to-air fight. You can run up to anything and take it out very easily. I will be the first one to admit I am not the best AirRB player in the world, and even I feel very confident flying this airframe against literally anything in the game right now. This is probably the best aircraft for air-to-air combat that exists in the game of War Thunder at top tier right now. Might change a little bit later down the line, but for the time being, this thing is fantastic against other aircraft. And it's no slouch against ground battles. In ground battles, you have access to the suite of laser-guided bombs that Barak 2 has, 500s, 1000s, 2000s, and you also have the AGM-65D Mavericks. The big thing about the D Mavericks is they have additional thermal imaging on top of the optical imaging, so you can actually pick up targets in low light significantly better than the regular Mavericks can. The only real drawback this has over the Barak 2 is that it doesn't have the internal pylon with the double 500-pounders. So if you want to take 2 Sparrows, the only options for laser-guided bombs to take with that is a pair of 2,000-pounders, which is fine, it's just not as much damage potential. But overall, the F-16C is incredibly versatile in the air-to-air role, it's incredibly versatile in the air-to-ground role. You can engage any target at any distance. This is the type of airframe where you never have to be nervous about picking a fight with anything, whether it be a radar site on the ground or another plane. you can just take on anything and win. It's absolutely a fantastic aircraft. If you haven't researched it, you definitely should. It very much deserves its rating as a 12.3 airframe. In fact, it might even deserve to go a little higher if they do end up raising the ceiling. And that concludes our video. What do you think about the F-16s? Do you agree with my ratings? Do you disagree? Feel free to throw in the comments down below which ones are your favorites and which ones you don't really care for all that much. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it fun. Have a nice day, everybody.